Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Ethan Harris cherished his sprawling 50-acre property, a family legacy passed down through generations. But returning from a trip, he found a massive warehouse looming on his land, a clear violation of his boundaries and heritage. What began as a plea for fairness spiraled into a battle of rights, threats, and justice. Ethan Harris had always taken pride in his family's legacy. Nestled in the rolling hills of rural Ohio, his 50-acre property was more than just land. It was a connection to his past. The land had been in the Harris family for generations, passed down with the understanding that it was to be cherished and protected. Ethan, an architect by trade, had chosen to live here, not just for the peace and beauty, but also to honor his family's memory. It was his sanctuary, a place where time seemed to move slower and life felt simpler. The property was vast, dotted with trees and open fields, bounded by old wooden fences that marked its edges. His home, a renovated farmhouse, sat near the center of the estate, ensuring privacy and offering a sweeping view of the land. Ethan had designed his life to balance solitude with creativity, working remotely while maintaining his family's heritage. His closest neighbor, Richard Mason, had moved in about a year ago to the adjacent property. They had exchanged polite greetings, but never shared more than surface-level pleasantries. Returning from a week-long business trip, Ethan pulled into his gravel driveway, feeling the familiar sense of calm that always accompanied his homecoming. But as he rounded the bend near the western edge of his land, something unfamiliar caught his eye. He slowed the car and squinted into the distance. There it was, a large metallic structure rising awkwardly against the horizon. A warehouse-like building with corrugated steel walls and a stark, industrial look now occupied the open space near the western border of his property. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He parked the car and walked closer, his boots crunching over the uneven ground. The closer he got, the clearer it became. The structure was not just near his property, it was on it. It stood roughly 200 yards from his home, unmistakably intruding onto the Harris land. Tire tracks and the marks of heavy machinery scarred the soil, leading directly onto Ethan's property. A small gravel path had been laid alongside the structure, and on its doors hung a bright yellow sign. Mason Storage, Private Property. Ethan's mind raced. He hadn't authorized any construction. How could this have happened without his knowledge? He walked a slow circle around the warehouse, his phone in hand, snapping pictures of the building, the tracks, and the encroachment onto his land. Every image fueled a growing sense of disbelief and frustration. Later that evening, Ethan sat at his dining table surrounded by papers. He pulled out the property deed, maps, and surveys that his family had meticulously kept over the years. Each document told the same story. The land where the warehouse now stood was undeniably his. For decades, the Harris family had maintained clear boundaries, marked by sturdy fences and confirmed by county records. A knot tightened in his stomach as the implications set in. The neighboring Mason property was close, but its borders didn't overlap with his. Richard Mason, his polite but distant neighbor, had gone too far. This wasn't just an encroachment, it was a violation of his family's legacy. Despite his rising anger, Ethan knew he needed to act carefully. He wasn't one for impulsive decisions, and the idea of starting a feud with his neighbor didn't sit well with him. Still, he couldn't let this go unaddressed. Ethan resolved to speak with Richard directly, determined to approach the situation with calm and logic. Maybe it was a mistake, a misunderstanding that could be resolved without conflict. As Ethan prepared his evidence, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. What if Richard refused to cooperate? What if this was intentional? He shook his head, refusing to dwell on those possibilities just yet. For now, he focused on the facts. The land was his, and the warehouse didn't belong there. Ethan looked out of his kitchen window toward the west. The warehouse loomed faintly in the distance, its silhouette a jarring reminder that peace was fragile. He took a deep breath, readying himself for what was to come. The morning sun broke over the rolling fields of Ethan's property, casting long shadows across the land. With a folder of documents in hand, Ethan stepped onto his porch, determination stiffening his resolve. It had been a restless night, his thoughts circling the unwelcome warehouse that now marred the harmony of his land. But Ethan was a man of calm temperament. He believed in fairness and giving others the benefit of the doubt. Surely Richard Mason, his neighbor, hadn't intentionally overstepped, or so Ethan hoped. The walk to Richard's house took a few minutes along a dirt path that wound between their properties. Richard's house, though smaller than Ethan's farmhouse, was newly built and had the same clean, efficient lines as the warehouse. Ethan's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the front door, mentally rehearsing what he would say. Richard answered the knock swiftly, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and jeans, a mug of coffee in one hand. His expression shifted from polite curiosity to mild defensiveness the moment Ethan mentioned the warehouse. "Good morning, Richard," Ethan began with a steady tone. "I'd like to talk to you about the new structure near our property line. I've reviewed my records, and it appears the warehouse is on my land." Richard raised an eyebrow and leaned against the doorframe. "Your land?" "I don't think so, Ethan. I had a survey done before construction, and it confirmed that area belongs to me." Ethan held up his folder of documents. "I've checked my deed and the property maps. They clearly show the land in question is part of my family's property. I've also conducted my own measurements, and the results align with the original boundaries." Richard sighed, his coffee mug hovering near his lips. "Look, Ethan, I appreciate your concern, but my surveyor's work is accurate. I don't think there's an issue here." Ethan remained composed. "I understand there could be a discrepancy, but this is a significant structure, Richard. I don't want this to escalate into something larger than it needs to be. I'm giving you the chance to resolve this amicably." He paused, ensuring his voice conveyed sincerity rather than accusation. "You have 1 week to address this. If it turns out I'm mistaken, I'll be the first to apologize. But if the warehouse is indeed on my land, I'll have no choice but to take further action." Richard's expression hardened, though he kept his tone civil. "I'll check my survey and get back to you. But I stand by my people's work." Ethan nodded. "That's all I'm asking. I'd rather sort this out without lawyers or unnecessary trouble." The conversation ended there, and Ethan made his way back home, feeling a mix of unease and hope. He had laid out his concerns clearly and respectfully, leaving Richard with room to make the right choice. As someone who valued fairness, Ethan believed he had done everything possible to avoid a confrontation. For the next few days, Ethan busied himself with work, trying to push the situation to the back of his mind. He contacted his attorney, Sarah Meyer, to explain the situation and ensure he was prepared for any outcome. Sarah reviewed Ethan's evidence and reassured him. "You're on solid ground here, Ethan, literally and legally. The documents are clear, and your measurements confirm the boundary. If Mason refuses to comply, you'll have a strong case in court," she said with confidence. Ethan appreciated her calm professionalism, but he still clung to the hope that Richard would realize his mistake and act responsibly. On the 5th day, Ethan saw movement near the warehouse. Workers were unloading equipment, their trucks kicking up dust as they drove onto his property. It seemed Richard was continuing to use the warehouse without hesitation, a clear sign he wasn't taking Ethan's concerns seriously. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan's patience wore thin. He couldn't shake the feeling that Richard wasn't just stubborn, he might be banking on intimidation or the idea that Ethan wouldn't push back. Despite this, Ethan resolved to wait the full week, giving Richard every chance to do the right thing. When the week finally came to an end, there was no message, no visit, and no sign that Richard intended to comply. The warehouse stood unchanged, a silent challenge to Ethan's patience and principles. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the folder of documents once more. His heart sank as he realized that his efforts to resolve the matter peacefully had been dismissed. The time for civility had passed. It was now clear Richard had no intention of removing the structure willingly. The next step was inevitable. Ethan picked up his phone and dialed Sarah. "It's time," he said simply, the calm in his voice masking the storm of frustration beneath. 2 days after the deadline passed, Ethan was reviewing sketches for a client in his home office when a loud knock echoed from the front door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and a flicker of unease crept in as he approached the door. Opening it, Ethan found Richard Mason standing there, flanked by a man in a tailored suit carrying a sleek leather briefcase. "Morning, Ethan," Richard said with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. His tone was friendlier than before, but there was a tension behind his words that set Ethan on edge. "This is Mr. Dunn, my attorney. We've reviewed your claims, and I wanted to discuss a way we can resolve this situation." Ethan nodded cautiously, motioning for them to step onto the porch, but not inside. "I'm listening." Richard wasted no time. "Turns out you're right. The The warehouse does sit on your property. There were some errors in the survey I used, and I'll admit that's on me. But here's the thing." He paused, gesturing toward the direction of the warehouse. "I've put a lot of money into building that structure. It wasn't cheap, and it's housing some valuable equipment for my business. Relocating all of that would cost me a fortune." Ethan crossed his arms, already sensing where this was going. "So," Richard continued, his smile widening into something he probably thought was disarming, "I'd like to propose a deal. You sell me that section of land, the area where the warehouse sits, for, let's say, $10,000. That way, you get some easy cash, and I get to keep the warehouse. Everybody wins." Ethan stared at him in disbelief. The offer was not only laughably low, but also insulting. That section of land was part of his family's legacy, and selling it was out of the question. "Richard," Ethan said evenly, "this land isn't just dirt to me. It's part of my family's history, and I'm not interested in selling, especially not for a sum that wouldn't cover even a fraction of what it's worth." Richard's face hardened, and Mr. Dunn shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Come on, Ethan," Richard pressed. "Think about it. This is the simplest solution. You make a little profit, I save a lot of trouble, and we avoid dragging this into court." Ethan's resolve remained firm. "No, Richard, I won't sell. And, frankly, I find the offer insulting." Richard's polite facade cracked. His smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "You're being unreasonable," he snapped. "You don't need that piece of land. It's just sitting there, doing nothing, while my warehouse is productive and valuable. This is a win-win deal, Ethan. Don't be stubborn." Ethan held his ground. "It's my land, Richard. I've given you every chance to resolve this amicably. I won't sell, and I won't let you bully me into it." At that, Richard's demeanor turned menacing. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a threatening growl. "Let me make this clear, Ethan. If you don't sell me that land, I'll find another way to get it. You might think you've got the upper hand, but I've got resources, and I'm not afraid to use them. You're just an architect with a pile of old family papers. I can bury you in legal fees and headaches until you're begging to sell." Ethan felt a flash of anger but kept his composure. "If that's how you want to handle this, Richard, then you can leave now. You're trespassing, and I'm done talking." Richard's attorney looked uneasy, clearly uncomfortable with the turn the conversation had taken, but Richard ignored him, leaning closer to Ethan. "This isn't over," he hissed. "One way or another, I'll get what I want." Ethan stepped back, his voice firm. "You need to leave. Now." Richard hesitated, his expression a storm of frustration and anger, before finally turning on his heel. Mr. Dunn followed, throwing Ethan an apologetic glance as they walked away. Ethan watched them go, his heart pounding, knowing that Richard's threats were not empty. Inside, Ethan immediately called Sarah, his attorney, detailing the encounter. "This just went from a property dispute to a full-blown intimidation attempt," Sarah said grimly. "We'll move forward with the lawsuit, but keep documenting everything. And Ethan, be careful." Ethan ended the call and sat in silence, staring out of the window at the distant warehouse. The stakes had risen, and he knew this fight was far from over, but if Richard thought threats would force him to yield, he was sorely mistaken. Ethan sat in the quiet of his study, surrounded by a mountain of evidence he had meticulously gathered over the past few weeks. Photographs of the warehouse encroaching on his property, GPS measurements confirming the boundary violations, and copies of the deed that left no room for doubt, all neatly arranged in a folder he would soon take to court. The weight of the upcoming legal battle pressed heavily on him, but it also fueled his resolve. The court date arrived on a crisp morning, and Ethan walked into the courthouse alongside his attorney, Sarah Meyer. Sarah, a sharp and experienced litigator, had reviewed every detail of the case and assured Ethan they had an ironclad argument. "It's going to be straightforward," she said as they entered the courtroom. "The evidence is on our side, and the law is clear." Richard Mason entered moments later, his confident swagger masking the tension beneath. Flanking him was Mr. Dunn, his lawyer, who carried a briefcase stuffed with papers. Ethan couldn't help but notice Richard's glance, an icy mix of defiance and frustration, before he took his seat. The proceedings began, and Sarah opened the case with precision. She laid out the evidence methodically, starting with the historical property records that had been meticulously preserved by Ethan's family. The Harris property boundaries have remained unchanged for over 5 decades, she told the judge, presenting the original deed and survey maps. Then came the photos, showing the warehouse standing blatantly within those boundaries. Sarah's argument was concise, logical, and bolstered by the undeniable facts. When it was Richard's turn to present his defense, his lawyer tried to muddy the waters. Mr. Dunn argued that the boundary line was unclear due to outdated surveys, and that Richard had acted in good faith based on his hired surveyor's findings. My client believed he was building on his own land, Dunn insisted, but the judge quickly honed in on the lack of supporting evidence. Where is the survey report your client relied on? The judge asked, her tone firm but neutral. Dunn faltered, admitting, it was a private survey and wasn't filed with the county. The judge raised an eyebrow. Without an official record, your argument lacks credibility, counselor. Mr. Harris's documentation is thorough, and it's clear the warehouse is on his property. As the case unfolded, Sarah's calm confidence contrasted with Richard's growing agitation. Ethan watched as his neighbor fidgeted in his seat, the smugness from their previous interactions now replaced by thinly veiled frustration. The turning point came when Sarah presented an audio recording of Richard's earlier threats. In addition to the unlawful construction, Mr. Mason attempted to intimidate my client into surrendering his land, Sarah explained, playing the recording in which Richard openly threatened to bury Ethan in legal fees and implied further retaliation. The courtroom fell silent as the recording played. Richard's attorney looked visibly shaken, clearly unprepared for such damning evidence. When the judge finally spoke, her tone was decisive. The evidence is overwhelming. Mr. Mason, you have not only trespassed and constructed a building on Mr. Harris's property without authorization, but you've also engaged in actions that could be interpreted as intimidation. I am ruling in favor of Mr. Harris. The relief Ethan felt was almost overwhelming, but the judge wasn't done. She issued a formal order requiring Richard to remove the warehouse at his own expense and restore the land to its original condition. Furthermore, she mandated that Richard pay Ethan $100,000 in damages and imposed a strict no-contact order to prevent further harassment. Richard's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he stood in stunned silence. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of his actions. Ethan watched him leave the courtroom with Mr. Dunn trailing behind, both looking deflated. As Sarah packed up their materials, she turned to Ethan with a small smile. It's over. You stood your ground, and justice prevailed. Ethan nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude and pride. The legal battle was won, but he knew the victory came not just from the law, but from his unwavering determination to defend what was his. Ethan sat silently in the courtroom, his focus unwavering as the judge prepared to deliver the final ruling. The air was thick with tension, a culmination of weeks of legal maneuvers, evidence gathering, and courtroom arguments. Though Ethan had remained calm throughout the process, the emotional toll of defending his family's legacy had been immense. Now the moment of truth had arrived. The judge began by summarizing the case. This court has reviewed extensive documentation, including property deeds, survey maps, photographic evidence, and audio recordings. The question at hand is whether Mr. Mason's warehouse was constructed on land belonging to Mr. Harris and whether any further legal violations occurred in the process. Her tone was firm, leaving no room for doubt that she had scrutinized every detail. Ethan held his breath as she continued. The evidence clearly establishes that Mr. Mason's warehouse is located on Mr. Harris's property, in violation of property rights. Additionally, Mr. Mason's actions, including unpermitted construction and intimidation tactics, are both legally and ethically unacceptable. Richard, seated a few rows away, stared straight ahead, his previously confident demeanor now replaced with a stoic mask. His attorney, Mr. Dunn, shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly anticipating the fallout. The judge's voice grew sharper. This court orders the immediate removal of the warehouse at Mr. Mason's expense. Furthermore, Mr. Mason is required to pay $100,000 in damages to Mr. Harris for the unlawful use of his land and the emotional distress caused by his actions. A no-contact order will also be imposed to prevent further harassment or interference. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight on his shoulders finally lifting. It was over. Richard's frustration boiled over as he rose abruptly, muttering under his breath, "This isn't fair." The judge fixed him with a cold stare. Mr. Mason, if you have further objections, they can be addressed through appropriate legal channels. But let me be clear, this court will not tolerate any further violations of the law." Richard sank back into his seat, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. Ethan, meanwhile, exchanged a small smile with Sarah, who whispered, "We did it." As the court adjourned, Ethan stood and gathered his things, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The victory wasn't just a legal one, it was a validation of his perseverance and commitment to what mattered most. Outside the courthouse, reporters and curious onlookers lingered, but Ethan ignored them, focusing instead on the sight of his attorney walking beside him. "Thank you for everything, Sarah," he said, extending a hand. "You earned this, Ethan," she replied. "You didn't back down, and you fought for what's right. That makes all the difference." As Ethan drove home, he glanced toward the western edge of his property, where the warehouse still stood, awaiting its removal. The sight no longer filled him with dread or frustration. Justice had prevailed, and Ethan had defended his legacy with dignity and resolve. The days following the court's decision brought a flurry of activity to Ethan's property. True to the judge's order, contractors hired by Richard Mason arrived early one morning to begin dismantling the warehouse. Ethan watched from his porch as the towering structure that had caused him so much stress was taken apart piece by piece. The rhythmic sound of machinery was oddly satisfying. It marked the physical undoing of Richard's transgression and the restoration of Ethan's land. By the end of the week, the warehouse was gone, leaving behind bare ground and a few tire marks. True to the ruling, the contractors worked diligently to restore the area, reseeding the soil and replacing damaged sections of the old wooden fence that marked the property line. Ethan felt a sense of closure as the final truck rumbled down the dirt path, leaving his land undisturbed once more. Richard, however, was nowhere to be seen. The once brash and overconfident neighbor had gone silent. Ethan heard through mutual acquaintances that Richard was struggling to recover from the financial and reputational blow dealt by the lawsuit. The $100,000 damages and the costs of demolition had been substantial, and rumors swirled that Richard's business was facing difficulties. Despite everything, Ethan couldn't bring himself to feel vindictive. He had defended what was his, and justice had been served, but he hoped that Richard would learn from the experience and choose a different path moving forward. Ethan also found himself at the center of his local community's admiration. Neighbors who had heard about the case began stopping by to express their support and congratulations. "You stood up for yourself, and for all of us, really," one older neighbor said, tipping his hat as he passed. "It's good to know some people still care about doing what's right." As Ethan walked along the western edge of his land one evening, the horizon glowing with the colors of sunset, he paused at the spot where the warehouse had once loomed. The earth was bare but peaceful, and for the first time in months, Ethan felt like the land was truly his again. The scars left by the conflict, on the ground and in his life, were already beginning to heal. Months after the dust had settled, Ethan found himself walking the familiar paths of his property, now fully restored to its former tranquility. The ground where the warehouse had once stood was lush with new grass, blending seamlessly into the rest of his land. The ordeal was over, but its lessons lingered in his mind, shaping the way he viewed both his neighbors and himself. Ethan's victory was more than a legal one. It was a reaffirmation of the values his family had instilled in him: integrity, resilience, and a deep respect for what had been passed down through generations. Protecting the land wasn't just about ownership. It was about honoring the legacy of his parents and grandparents who had worked hard to preserve it. He reflected on how easily the situation could have escalated into something darker if not for his patience and measured approach. There had been moments when anger and frustration threatened to overtake him, but Ethan had chosen to act with clarity and principle, even in the face of Richard's intimidation and threats. As for Richard Mason, his presence in the neighborhood had faded. Ethan had heard through mutual acquaintances that Richard's business had suffered, and he had since sold his property and moved away. While Ethan harbored no ill will, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, knowing that Richard's disruptive influence was no longer a factor. The experience also left Ethan more connected to his community. Neighbors who had once been mere acquaintances now regarded him with respect, and some had even sought his advice on their own property disputes. One day, during a community gathering, a fellow landowner approached Ethan and said, "You showed us all that it's possible to stand up for what's right without losing your humanity. That's rare these days." Ethan smiled, humbled by the sentiment. He hadn't sought recognition, but knowing his actions had inspired others gave him a quiet sense of pride. Standing on the porch one quiet evening, Ethan looked out over the rolling hills of his land, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves. The conflict with Richard was now just a memory, but it had solidified Ethan's bond with his home and his resolve to protect it. This land, with its history and beauty, was more than just a place to live. It was a testament to the strength of standing firm in the face of adversity, and a reminder that justice, when pursued with patience and dignity, could prevail.